Thank you, Tom. Honourable John Howard, Professor Tom Frame, colleagues, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. The challenge of welfare reform, it's $150 billion of government outlays. It's a complex system that's very difficult for people to understand and to navigate. It's a system also that needs to adapt to a changing employment market. Part-time work, casual, higher skilled jobs, more women in the workforce, an expectation that people who have capacity should be in training or work. And the goal really of welfare reform is to assist people to participate socially and economically in the economy. It's a balancing act though, as is most good social policy. On the one hand, there's the warm hearts, the incentives for people to act and to get into training and jobs, but there's also the counter of obligations, and I would call that hard heads. The system itself is extraordinarily complex. People gasp when they actually saw this diagram, but a complex system of 20 payments and 55 supplements that have evolved over 50 years, with all of the inherent difficulties and disincentives for people to get into work because of taper rates and taxation. I was appointed by the Howard government, and specifically Jocelyn Newman, to chair an independent reference group, and we embarked on an 18-month process of 300 submissions, 200 consultations with business and community groups. I've gone one too many there. Where are we? There we go. 300 submissions, 200 consultations with business and community and focus groups, and the final report had 65 recommendations. We called it Participation Support for a More Equitable Society. And I want to just outline some of the key pillars of reform. One was an individualised service delivery. The key reforms there were Centrelink as a gateway for assessment, so the agency Centrelink, the streaming of individuals with capacity for work into appropriate levels of assistance. So 75% of them were job seekers that could move quite seamlessly through the system into jobs, then those that required low-level assistance, and finally those with high-level assistance, which included programs like the new Work for the Dole program and intensive assistance for people with multiple issues, mental health problems, long-term unemployment, lack of education, lack of social skills, and so on. And this was something that was quite different. It was a tailored approach to addressing this issue of how do we get people, particularly long-term unemployed, into education and training. There was also, after that, access to training and employment services. And another revolution of the Howard government was really the privatised job network, where employment services moved from a government provider to a network of commercial, corporate and faith-based organisations providing employment and training, including, of course, Mission Australia, which I was CEO of. The results of this, and it was very controversial, it was attacked by the unions and even by the churches. We were all told we'd be ruined, as Hanrahan said, but we survived and thrived. That it actually produced better outcomes and also savings to government, the job network. And then in addition, there was an integrated IT system that linked providers with Centrelink and also with government. A second pillar of reform was an integrated payment structure. The proposed income support structure was to have a standard base rate for both pensions and allowances. This was something that was quite new because, as you saw before, the complex system made quite a differential between various payments, and there were different obligations on each payment in terms of taper rates and so on. But at that stage, there was only an $80 per fortnight difference between pensions and allowances. Of course, today it's more like $300. But there was the opportunity there for a cost of something like $500 million for the government to develop a standard base rate and then to have add-on modules, which were for the cost of children and childcare, the cost of rental housing, cost of disability and so on. And also we were reducing the marginal tax rates for part-time work. It would have been a very simple system and would have probably solved many of the complexity issues that we're confronted with now and the inequities that are in the system. And so one might say that this was perhaps an opportunity that was lost. And I'll explain why a little later. The paradigm shift in welfare reform under the Howard government was the introduction of the notion of mutual obligation. And this was for individuals, but we broadened it out also to say, well, hang on, there's a responsibility for government and business if this is going to be truly mutual. But for individuals, it was very controversial. ACOS and many of the advocacy groups said that we'd had previously a universal system without obligations, and to impose obligations would be unfair. But on the reference group, we argued, certainly in our discussions, that it would be, as long as they were fair and reasonable, the obligations, most Australians would accept the notion of mutual obligation. And so what we said was that people of workforce age with the capacity to work have an obligation to seek training or work. But we also acknowledged that there were people, say, with caring responsibilities who already fulfill their obligations. So it might be those that are caring for a young child, person with a disability, an older person or frail aged person. We also stated that people who had significant or permanent disability already fulfill their obligation. But those who had the capacity to work, there would be the need for compliance, and there were sanctions that would be imposed after counselling, the reduction of payments and so on, that there were sanctions for non-compliance. One example of mutual obligation, which again had been or was very controversial at the time, was that for sole parents. And so the argument that the reference group put was that 50% of sole parents are already in part-time work or in full-time work. But parents whose youngest child is under 6, or if they have a child with a disability, have already met their obligations. We thought the parenting role there was adequate in terms of social and economic participation. But between 6 and 13 years, they were required to attend an annual interview to discuss their capacity for work or training. And once the youngest child turned 13, they were required to seek part-time training or work. And there were exemptions that we had in place there for family violence or for bereavement. So again, that balancing of obligation, but also providing incentives and arguing that it was really an opportunity for people that wanted to be in the workforce to be able to access part-time education and training options. In trying to develop a balanced view of mutual obligation, though, we also talked about the roles of government and business. We said that government's responsibility was, of course, to manage the economy, to enable economic growth and the jobs that people would be pursuing, that they also had a responsibility to maintain an adequate income support system, But business also had the obligation of complying with workplace health and safety and with awards, to have flexible and friendly, family-friendly workplaces, particularly to accommodate people with disabilities or sole parents, and that also corporates begin to look at types of programs, whether it was internships, cadetships, certainly pathways for disadvantaged groups into their organisation. And those groups were people with disability, Indigenous people and sole parents. The reference group was conscious too that one of the big issues was building capacity, providing jobs in regional and rural areas. And so we recommended the role of public and private partnerships to fund local infrastructure and jobs in regional areas. We also encouraged further funding and support for the Prime Minister's Community Business Partnership Board, of which I'd been a member, but which consisted of a number of very high-profile business people, people from the community sector and so on. And it had been highly successful in developing strategic partnerships between business and community organisations, and developed annual awards that were very popular, certainly across the corporate sector and also the community sector. We also encouraged the development and legislation for private and public ancillary funds, and I'll talk about the important role that they've played in the community sector as well. And finally, the group recommended the support for micro business and social enterprises. Today, there's about 20,000 social enterprises across Australia. These are businesses with a social purpose that provide goods and services in many areas that are regional and rural. And of course, the success of micro business, particularly for women entrepreneurs, was internationally recognised, and we felt that there needed to be more training and also access to capital to support micro business. The response to the report when it was launched was quite overwhelming. There was all-party support, LNP, Labor, and also the Australian Democrats. In fact, I remember meeting afterwards with John Perrin, the Prime Minister's ministerial advisor, and also the Prime Minister, and he congratulated me and said that it was one of the few times that there'd been tripartite support for what might have been a controversial social policy program. The media response also was very positive, 95% positive, and in the 2001 budget there was $1.7 billion allocated over 4 years. I wanted $1 billion in the first year, but it was really spread over the 4 years, and as often happens with changes of minister, the momentum was lost over those 4 years, and some of the initiatives that might have been implemented weren't done to the satisfaction that I would have hoped. But there was an excellent document that was put together, Australians working together, helping people to move forward, and it contained a range of funding of the recommendations that we had suggested. What the participation support for a more equitable society did at that time was really develop a paradigm shift. It imposed mutual obligations on people with workforce capacity, and also in a way that was seen as balanced on people with disabilities and sole parents. It developed an individualised service delivery model that tailored services to meet the particular needs of unemployed people. There were welfare to work initiatives that were developed under Minister Andrews, particularly in relation to Indigenous people, people with disabilities, again, mature age people, so that there were pathways into corporates for them. And the notion of business and community partnerships became a permanent part of the community landscape in a way that they hadn't been before. And that really is a strategically beneficial partnership between a large corporate and a community organisation where there's a mutual benefit to both. Lessons from those years. The final report was a very positive social policy initiative of the Howard government and a key platform of the 2001 budget. The second one, and so in a sense, I believe welfare reform can easily be good social policy ground for a coalition government and future coalition governments. The reform, though, requires the leadership of the minister to advocate the case for change to the PM and to the Cabinet. And the change of ministers, Jocelyn Newman to Amanda Vanstone, meant that some of that momentum was lost. And also the key advisor to the Prime Minister, John Perrin, tragically passed during that time. And so that strong advocacy wasn't so apparent. It was interesting too that initially the minister had wanted a very harsh approach to welfare reform, but a paper that she was to present was leaked to the public, and there was very strong public and media reaction. And the PMO's office intervened, particularly through John Perrin, and of course the reference group was formed under the auspice of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office. And the lesson really, I believe, after a lifetime of really and career of working with low-income people, is that the key is this balance between warm hearts, which are incentives, but also hard heads, obligations, so that it meets the sunlight test, which essentially is that most Australians looking at it would say, well, we think that's fair and reasonable. Other lessons. The mix of community business and public service representatives on the reference group, which was something quite new, led to a more creative and balanced approach, certainly led to much more robust discussion and I believe a more balanced report. The recommendation to align the levels of pension and allowance was not implemented in 2001. This was, I think, quite a tragedy, and Tony Abbott actually, as minister, had put together a paper. It was all there of how they could do it, but for whatever reason, the momentum is lost. And therein lies the problem of long-term reform. And so this increasing level of difference between pensions and allowances, which is now $300 a fortnight, has led to increasing inequity over the past 18 years. And of course, the focus now on welfare reform is very much about increasing New Start allowance to try and bring it up or closer to the pension level. In the subsequent years, the changes in ministers for social services, there were 6 in the period 2013 to 19, have impeded really the momentum for long-term change. But I wanted to really also stress the importance of the PM's Community Business Partnership Board, which facilitated legislation for the private and ancillary funds, PAFs as they're known. Today there are 1,300 PAFs, which involve a lot of families and also corporate foundations, but they distribute over $460 million per year to charities and have over $4 billion in funds under management. A great initiative. To turn to more recent reform, I was invited again to chair a reference group on welfare reform in 2015, as part of the Abbott government and under Kevin Andrews and then Scott Morrison. And we developed, the reference group developed a report, a new system for better employment and social outcomes. And it was very much building on the foundation of those Howard government reforms. We looked at simpler architecture, and there are a number of recommendations, and that is really an ongoing task. But 2 other initiatives I think I'd like just to spell out to you. One is the priority investment approach, which involves an actuarial analysis to identify groups with the highest future lifetime cost of welfare dependence, and then the funding of early intervention strategies with them, and it saves billions in future costs, and of course is very appealing to Treasury. The other initiative I wanted to mention was social impact investment to address entrenched social issues, for example, affordable housing, but it could be the cost of childcare and not childcare, cost of children and out-of-home care, for example. But this is an investment that private investment that generates a financial return to the investor, but also has a major social impact. And the notion of social benefit bonds is part of the social impact investment. And the New South Wales government has taken a strong lead in this area, and I've been on an advisory group with them. But watch the space in lots of ways, because globally there's a great deal of interest of how we can attract private funds because of lack of taxation funds from government, that we can attract private funds to address entrenched social problems with a return for investors. Finally, I'd just like to spell out the priority investment approach, because I believe it's one of and it was one of our recommendations in my more recent report, because I believe it is a very important initiative in terms of policy development and government funding. It was started really in New Zealand under John Keys and Bill English as Treasurer, and our reference group spent some time over there looking at the model and at adapting it to Australian conditions. So it's an actuarial model which predicts the future income support use by the Australian population. It predicts how people will move in and out of the welfare system and at different life stages. And people are grouped into 12 broad classes. There are 6 for income support recipients, 3 for people receiving payments but no income support, and 3 for the rest of the population. And each year, the actuarial model is enhanced by taking into account changes in the economy and the unemployment rate. Oh, have I done something wrong there? That's it. Where are we up to? Looking at the findings from this actuarial analysis, people in the parenting class, so particularly the sole parent, the disability support class, so people with a disability, and there's increasing numbers of people with episodic depression and anxiety that are moving into that disability support class, and carers class have the highest average future lifetime costs. So what this model then suggests is, as we have done, is to set up a try, test and learn fund, a $100 million fund, for early intervention projects. So to try and address or provide pathways to young people that are young carers, young parents, working age carers, mature age people, at-risk youth, all of those with the most potential for future lifetime costs of welfare dependence. This early intervention fund means to divert them from the welfare system and into the mainstream society and economic and social participation. And in a recent article in The Australian of the 14th of October, with the latest actuarial analysis, it was showing that it's working, that there's been $700 billion in future savings between the first actuarial analysis of 2015 and 2018. So what I think is a very creative approach to addressing this entrenched problem of welfare dependence. So thank you very much.
So Patrick, was the existence of the reference group a way to deal with perhaps an absence of experience and expertise in government departments to give the government the options that it needed, that obviously you put to it later?
Yeah, well, it was very interesting because the original paper had come from the department and also the minister, and it just had been leaked, and there was this terrible reaction to it. And so I think it was really quite clever of the Prime Minister's office to establish an independent reference group with people that were from the community sector, but also business representatives and public servants. And then, well, it was our report, and it was always said, oh, this is the McClure report, it wasn't the government report. So I was the one that either copped the praise or criticism. So I thought it was clever, but more than that, I think it's quite good to get different eyes, you know, and people with different experience looking at a problem, and it comes up with more creative solutions, I believe, and certainly the public reaction seemed to suggest that.
So clever practically because the government got access to your real world experiences, but politically clever because if you'd come up with something that was politically perhaps unsavoury, then the government could have said, well, the experts have told us this is what we need to do.
Well, the big thing was this mutual obligation. I mean, it was, and everyone was very nervous about it, and so it was very controversial. I mean, certainly the press conference, they were fairly tough, but once the report had come out and they saw the balanced approach to it, in fact, the media embraced it and the public embraced it, so it was quite interesting.
And the timing of it meant that, say, by 2000, when the budget was back in the black, government debt had been repaid, this wasn't seeming, at least publicly, to be driven by the Howard government wants to claw back money from welfare to put it into other things. Is that how it felt at the time? It wasn't being driven financially, but in terms of outcomes.
Absolutely, and I think the Australians Working Together document, where there was an investment in the 1.7 billion that had been promised in the budget over the 4 years, showed that it wasn't just about cuts. And that's the difficulty. I mean, even when I was doing it in 2015, because it was a Conservative government, the whole sector is saying, oh, look, this is all about cuts. And I'm saying, no, hang on. We're looking at a priority investment approach. This is actually very, very clever. Oh, it'll be used for cuts. I said, no. So, yes, there's always... but I think this is the opportunity to take the high ground if a coalition or any government wants to, because, you'll get the results, but it often just means, it's like with anything, the early intervention is often much more successful than waiting until, problems have become much more entrenched.
And the turnover of ministers, would it have been better if it had been, well, we know we've got the minister for 3 years, or the full term. We mightn't have them for 6 years, but we're assured of having them for 3 years. Would that have made the kind of difference you're really suggesting that it might?
Oh, it would have. I mean, well, when I did the 2015, that was the more graphic. I mean, it was just 1 year, Kevin Andrews, and we worked very well together, and there was momentum there, and then suddenly he went, then Scott Morrison came in, then Christian Porter came in, Paul Fletcher, and and then, of course, changes also within government departments. But to have a minister for 3 years, I suppose you could almost say it would be nice to have a prime minister for 3 years too. So that it just gives a continuity that if welfare reform is the long term. It's not a quick fix.
And what do the ministers get out of it for their own reputation? So there has to be a reason for the turnover. Part of it is that ministers think, well, am I going to really look good because I've done social security well? Is there something that you could see on your side? That there are reforms, you can make your name and build a reputation? Well,
anecdotally, I did hear that the current Prime Minister did say to people when he was aspiring to be Treasurer, look, I did a great job with welfare reform. So it obviously... but again, the key, I think, is if you're advising government and it's working with the Minister, working with the office, and together coming up with what's, I'm interested in sort of positive outcomes.
Yes, for sure. Questions, please. And one at the back and one over here. Just wait till the microphone comes. Troy, thank you.
Troy Reeves. In 2008, when former Howard government staffers were as popular as flies at a barbecue, I found myself in the system. I was asked, could I read and write? I was provided with no assistance whatsoever, sent to, I guess, group meetings with people who had very low levels of literacy and employment readiness. And when I finally found another job with a Liberal senator, again through my own means, the agency I was with, I understand, got a payment of about $8,000 from the government. To me, as a lifelong Liberal, that doesn't seem like the intent of the system, and it seems to me that it very much was aimed at people at the very low level with no skills and didn't provide any support to those who were just out of work for a short time and needed a little bit of financial backing while they found something else.
Yeah, well, you would have been part of that 75% that would move generally pretty seamlessly, just simply because of the skill levels and everything. I'd be very surprised if the provider received that amount of money for you, because particularly over time, there just wasn't the funding in the system for that. But certainly the concentration was very much on those that, the long-term unemployed, people with barriers to unemployment, and that's, where the funding was, whether it was intensive assistance, participation support, literacy and numeracy, all of those things. But no, probably for that 75% that come and go through, the system isn't as particularly supportive, and I could understand it was difficult and that you were probably thrown back on your own resources and your own networks. But was it a good outcome? Did you get a job that you wanted eventually?
Well, I went back into the political party system, and again, it was all off my own back, and whatever payment they received, they didn't give me any assistance whatever.
No.
So I don't see why they deserve to be paid for it.
Yeah, well, that would be linked in 2008. By that stage, it was sort of star ratings and everything, and usually the funding was very much linked to an intervention. So I would have been surprised if they got very much at all for a person like you if there was no assistance.
Professor Tim Rouse.
Yesterday we heard a story about the declining influence of the trade union movement in Australian life. Yes. When an initiative like this takes the form of constituting a reference group that has expertise in the area and also some claim to representing community attitudes, why is it that the trade union movement is not given a seat at the table?
Well, I think it's a good question that you ask. I think really it's dependent on the government of the day who they choose to be on a reference group. I didn't choose the reference group. I was appointed to chair the reference group in the Howard government, and also the members of the reference group were chosen for me. So, but I hear what you're saying, that in the sense, and certainly the European model would very much embrace, sort of trade unionists. I'm not sure, maybe as the system evolves and as we develop, probably a better understanding with it, maybe that divide would cease. But it was what it was. It was the politics of the day. Possibly the Prime Minister's office could answer that better than I could.
And Phil Baresi.
Thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. One of the assertions of more dry-leaning Liberals is that the Howard government presided over an increase in middle-class welfare, and of course, as a result of that, there perhaps it's trapped the government and future governments into maintaining that level of welfare, and recipients to having an expectation, and those who are not receiving perhaps also feeling that they've missed out. So there's an expectation of government being there to not so much to lend a hand, but as a form of income assistance. Is this a concern for future governments, the growth in middle class welfare?
Look, I think it is a challenge, and it was really the family tax benefits that were introduced by the Howard government that have led to that situation. And it was really for parents, and it was providing, sort of childcare, meeting childcare costs. I think it was electorally probably very attractive, but in terms of good social policy, no, I wouldn't have supported it. I think what we need to have is a welfare system that's very targeted, that it's aimed really at those that are most disadvantaged, and it's all about getting people, where possible, where they've got the capacity, into employment and jobs. And I think the middle class dimension of it just adds to the complexity and also makes it just less sustainable.
At our first conference, Gary Johns made the remark that income for governments comes and goes, but entitlements last forever, as people kind of see it. Patrick, thanks this morning for talking about not just what you did in the Howard years, but since, as a way of helping us understand its longer term legacies. Would you please join with me in thanking Patrick this morning? Thank you.